Peter is the MSU Extension Forestry Specialist and an Associate Professor of Forest Ecology and Management, housed at the University of Montana in the Department of Forest Management. For the past 23 years, he has studied forest ecosystem function and dynamics, with specific interest in the role of disturbance processes across Idaho and Montana. During the past 10 years, Peter has worked extensively with private forest landowners and managers on forest assessment and management plan development, silvicultural alternatives, wildfire hazard reduction, and post-wildfire rehabilitation. So without further ado, here's Dr. Peter Cole.
All right, thanks a lot. We're going to dim the lights up front here a little bit because this is a complex topic. And they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. So rather than you listen to me in the next hour spout out 1 billion words, I'm going to show you an awful lot of pictures to get the point across. And if you were here for Dr. Larson's talk, I mean, fascinating stuff. And really, a lot of that work is what's the potential, what might be. In my arena of work, where I work with private landowners, I have to deal with what is. Okay, in a lot of cases, these are private lands burned over. And this is it burns out a lifetime, or in many cases, multi-generational work, and completely alters the forest that's on the landscape, which has a big impact not only on the economics for the landowner and the ecology of the landscape, but also on the psyche of the landowner. I mean, if you see your life's work or what your grandparents started, all of a sudden convert from a vibrant green growing forest into a black toothpick forest, it's emotionally and psychologically devastating. And so learning what you can do and what the possibilities are is what I work in a lot. And one correction, I've been doing this now actually for about 30 years. So I'm going to kind of share some experiences and some knowledge and some research over that time span. So the essence is, after fire, rehabilitation, what's the hurry? So I'm going to get right down the nuts and bolts of why that's something to consider. So first off, we need to consider fire physics. Fuel type, temperature, and moisture are the first factors that go into why something is going to burn, and potentially how it's going to burn. So here's, the start of the Bridger fire not too long ago, a couple of years ago. And based on the fuel types that were there and what we knew about it, we knew that this fire was going to go because things were dry. And it was a forest mixed with grasses and fine fuels that carried the fire, along with old trees that were in various stages of health and decline. So, but in all fires, wind is the game changer. Okay, so we can model fire behavior based on the fuels that are there and the fuel condition and the landscape topography. But wind changes everything, and wind is responsible for most firefighter deaths too. So the Yarnell fire that killed all those firefighters because the wind shifted with high wind speeds. The Colorado wildfire, it had burned through an area, the winds reversed and blew it back over the firefighters. It adds oxygen, so temperatures increase, fire intensity increases geometrically with increasing wind speed. And that's why the Bridger went from about 100 acres to 7,000 acres in about 8 hours, because now you see this plume is getting blown sideways. High winds are pushing this fire from just a fuels fire to a wind-driven fire. And the wind makes a lot of things scary. I mean, we had some firefighters that had to deploy shelters on the Bridger fire because the wind kicked up and moved too fast. It creates weird fire behavior, fire whirls that can be extremely dangerous, and they actually have killed people a mile from the fire front because they just zipped out like a tornado. But wind also increases fire intensity. So how hot is the fire? What's the flame length? And fire intensity, coupled with how long it burns on a site, basically creates how severe an impact it's going to have on a site. Okay, so impacts are also determined by what was there before. So in this case, you had a grass fire that burned, or actually it was a forest fire that burned down the grass meadow. Well, things are going to change based on what was there before. So in the dense timber, the trees were killed. There wasn't a lot of understory. So the recovery rate is going to take a lot longer. And we would label that as severe fire effects. Whereas on the more open forest site, grasses recover pretty quickly. They're rarely killed by fire unless they're growing in thick duff fuel accumulations. So what we often see after a fire and on ranches is the grassland areas, the first little bit of rain and boom, the grass starts popping back up. Okay? And this is important because grass for a lot of private forest landowners is a source of income, because a lot of our private forest landowners graze as a primary source of income, and the forest is there as a pasture, but also as a secondary source of income. And so, you know, one of the things that we've noticed over the years, of course, is thinning has multiple benefits. Not only does it make a crown fire less likely to occur, but because you have an intact understory of grasses and forbs and shrubs, these are often resprouters. And so the recovery in thin forests is an order of magnitude faster than on forests that don't have an intact understory, or where the understory is rooted in the duff layer that burns off. And the fire duration is a lot longer. So you can see that, you know, here's a prime example in the opening between trees. This is 2 months after the fire. We've got grass that is occupying the site. And in the background, where it was dense forest and we didn't have that understory, it's still in that post-burn condition. And, you know, how these fires recover is also going to depend on what kind of vegetation type you're in. Okay, so we've got fuel type for fire behavior, we've got moisture that exacerbates that, we have wind that exacerbates that even further, we have what's there before, but then we also have to break it out by what is the fire adaptedness of those species, what is their strategy in this long-term ecosystem that we have out here that has evolved with different kinds of fire. So we look at Ponderosa Pine Douglas Fir forests. This is a landowner that I had visited with. Retirement property, bought a little sawmill. This was what they were going to do for the next 30 years. Well, 3 years after I took this picture, we had a fire race across that. So there you go. And this is a site that I've tracked over 20 years of, you know, there's a lot of things we didn't know when fires started blowing up, starting with Yellowstone in 1988, and Mark Finney talked about that a little bit this morning. But 2000 was a real wake-up call, and so how do we deal with these fires and the after effects of fire? So there's a month or so after the fire. There's that same site 10 years later. There's that same site 20 years later. Okay, this is one of those landscape changes where this is converted from a forest that Dr. Larson was talking about to a grassland shrub field, if left to its own devices. Okay. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, let's look at subalpine fir, the wetter, higher elevation forests. So this was a lodgepole pine, late successional lodgepole pine, where subalpine fir had become the climax species on the site. So there was some lodgepole pine, a lot of it had been killed, was on the ground, pretty heavy fuel loading on the site. This picture is 1 year after the fire. So your recovery is very, very sparse on it. Thick duff layers. The seed source was mostly killed on this. Here's 6 years after the fire. There's 13 years after the fire. There's 20 years after the fire. And so our forest has very strongly changed from a subalpine fir, lodgepole pine forest. So we have a smattering of lodgepole pine. And remarkably, we saw quaking aspen seed into this area. This is a phenomenon that's basically unknown, because aspen is a clonal organism. And prior to this, and even now, it's very rare to see quaking aspen seed into an area. But this is one of those areas where we did see it seed in. But 20 years after the fire effects are still very relevant. Okay, so the soil surface has changed a bit, and we get this thick platy structure with what we call fire moss on there, which isn't really conducive for seed germination. Okay, and so 20 years later, there's still very profound fire effects on the site outside of vegetation change, but also soil changes. Okay, we look at then the more middle elevation. So the Valley Complex fires of 2000 burned 365,000 acres. Again, this was one of those big wake-up calls 22 years ago, where, oh my God, what happened here and how are we going to deal with it? Okay, so I got involved pretty early with this. And to give a little background, I was doing a forest health assessment as a postdoctoral work on the Boise National Forest in 1994, because there's a lot of tree mortality. Trying to figure out what was the role of insects, disturbance. And that year, as I was putting in plots all over the forest, that was a big fire year in the Boise, where about a third of the forest burned up. And to me, it was really an eye-opener because I had done all the measurements on forest conditions before they burned, and then I got to go back and see how they burned. And it was a real wake-up call for me. So here's the Sula State Forest, and of course, state lands, the mission is to make money for the state, right? And this was a fuel-driven fire. And pretty much 6,000 acres of state forest burned up in a stand replacing fire because there were heavy fuel loadings in there, because back then the concern was nutrient cycling, and all the logging slash was being dragged back in the forest for nutrient recycling, which created the fuel bed from hell. Okay, so we thought, okay, what are we going to do here? They're going to salvage log. How are we going to do this right? And Craig Thomas was the contractor. We worked pretty strongly with him, and I was really worried about soils. And so we set up inventory plots, and we monitored what happened on these sites. And so 3 years after, I had graduate students out there measuring soils, and we saw, some okay recovery on these sites. We saw knapweed triple its occupancy on these burned areas. Not only its density where it was, but it also occupied 30% more areas where right before the fire, right after the fire, we didn't see knapweed. Okay, so noxious weeds do like this disturbance level. Now I've monitored these areas now for the last 22 years. And so 2013, once knapweed gets a foothold, it's there for a while. Okay, and so here's 18 years after the fire. Okay, but I'll circle back, is I guess the common term. I'll circle back to this. So there's another factor that we need to consider in fires, and that is weather and fire severity can determine some outcomes, and specifically rainfall events on here. So this is a Derby fire, big rainstorm. Erosion is a real issue out there. So severity plays a big role, because if you had forbs and grasses that were not in the duff, thick fuel accumulations, they tend to resprout pretty quickly. These are not areas of concern. They resprout as soon as they get moisture after the fire, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later. Okay? The areas of concern is where there is no understory vegetation that has survived the fire. So this is where the deep needle accumulations, organic layers under Doug fir, you get these organic plates of material. And so in some places it's going to be ½ an inch thick. Other places I've measured it as deep as 5 inches of ash. Okay, and there's this common perception that they call this hydrophobicity, that these are water repellent layers. That is really an exaggerated term because the ash is actually hygroscopic. It loves moisture. Okay, it absorbs it very quickly. The problem with it is it holds onto the water, and you get what's called a hysteresis effect. It's like a wet sponge. It'll hold the water, but it won't let water through. So often underneath these saturated, greasy ash layers, the soil is bone dry because it won't let water through it. So the ash isn't really doesn't repel water. It absorbs the water and doesn't let water through it, and which makes it very greasy and highly erodible. Okay, so erosion off these sites is a real concern. And so here out in Ekalaka, there's pine forests out there. So this is one site where it burned, a pretty small basin, and a good rainfall event, not a lot, 1/4 inch in about an hour, ended up washing about a foot of soil against the back wall of this house and down into the ag field. So there were about 50 acres that had an additional foot of soil, which originated on the low ridge and basin behind the house. Okay, which means that soil is no longer there to grow trees or anything else back on that higher basin. Now, water movement is a cumulative effect, and so after fire we tend to want to armor waterways to keep them from eroding. But the real problem is that it's not where the water accumulates, or washes down, it's where the water accumulates on the landscape. And, here's in Laird Creek following fires of 2000, and this alluvial or fluvial fan is not the result of one fire. There's some really cool studies that have looked at, that excavated these, and this fluvial fan is actually the result of the last 10,000 years of fires out here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that this afternoon in my next talk. But the downstream events are often very catastrophic. Water doesn't stay on the mountainside, it comes down, it floods It causes a lot of erosion, which is sometimes good. It builds new channels. But if you happen to be downstream, like in Laird Creek, a 10-foot high wall of water and mud came down and washed out the houses that had survived the fire. You know, so it was pretty devastating to the folks that lived there. But to me, that was one event, or one problem. The real problem was where this water originated. So you go in the Upper Sula Basin. This is where the water originated, and it looks pretty rocky now, and you look at the old stumps. That rainfall event washed away a foot of topsoil from those upper slopes. And this site has now been altered for thousands of years because it takes a long time for soil to redevelop, and it will not support the vegetation that was there again. You've lost the soil productivity off of that site. It's all downstream in the creek bottom. Okay, so one of the tactics, of course, is to slow down water, contour felling. And it sort of works. You have to drop the trees on the contour, and you have to burn them in. And the idea is to slow water down, and also to provide barriers to erosion. Okay. Other tactics that were used is putting hay down to slow down water. The problem is that when we have bad wildfires, usually during drought, it's also when there's a shortage of hay. Okay. And so this is labor intensive, very costly, and you know, the ranchers would rather feed their cows than sell you hay to put on a burned area. Another option was seeding oats or commercial grains that have no persistence on the site. They'll grow because you seed them, but they won't reseed themselves onto the site. So minimal impact on native vegetation. The problem with this is the biggest impact after a fire is the spring following the fires. These haven't even germinated yet, so their impact on stabilizing the soil during the most critical period is really marginal. Okay, and so it looks pretty good in the summer, but you see there's lots of other vegetation that moved in. So really questionable whether this is valuable in the long term or not, unless you want to start harvesting grain off of your former forest. Okay, so I'm going to bring you a case study that we've done since the Bridger fire that I showed you in the beginning of this. So some landowners, Mike and Jody Christensen, some of you might know them. They've been managing their forest for 27 years. They've done a lot of thinning, even though they have a caveat or a local caveat or what's the word I'm looking for, rule that they can't commercially harvest. So they've done it non-commercially, and they just gave the firewood away. So this is their property in the Bridger fire. That's their land on the mountain slope. Their thinned forest burned completely because years before I said, well, if the fire comes from the mountaintop and burns down, your forest will be good. But if it circles around and comes up the bottom of the canyon, you're in a chimney, it won't blink. And well, unfortunately, it was the worst case scenario. Took out their house and their forest. So that's their landscape. And of course, they were pretty devastated, and they want to know, what do I do? Okay, so based on all of the applied history and the Sula study and all of that, there are many philosophies on restoration and rehabilitation after the fire. And the most commonly prescribed one is wait several years till the natural vegetation reestablishes, stabilizes the soil. Okay, and some have likened salvage logging to raping a robbery victim or something like that. I mean, it's a terrible analogy. But I had followed a little different philosophy based on what I've seen and what worked and what didn't. So fire does the initial disturbance. The vegetation is gone. Your biggest risk period is the spring after the fire, all that rain coming down on that ash and open soil. So if you log immediately after the fire, one is the machinery and the operation can mix the mineral, break up that ash layer that saturates with water and doesn't let water through. So we want to get water into the soil rather than running on the surface. So we gave instructions to the contractor who was very amenable to try and do their best. It was a commercial salvage log. This is when the trees have their highest value, right after the fire. Okay, the longer you wait, the more the value diminishes. And so in this mechanized logging, I said, when you drop those trees, smack them on the ground, because I want to break as many fine branches off as you can. Which is what they did. And, you know, skidding, of course, adds another element of soil disturbance. So we also asked the skidders to bring debris back onto these sites to put obstructions in the ruts that were created there. So here we are the winter after the logging on that site. As the snow started to melt, I had 60 photo points on this, and it monitored the whole time. So rain came down, and of course the disturbed soil starts to puddle as expected. And what we were worried about this dislodged mineral soil of moving downslope with running water. So what we wanted to do is create barriers for it. Not just in a random log here and there, which is a modified plinko board that the water goes around, but a real matrix, a surface that holds the water in place to prevent erosion. On top of which, the landowners helicopter seeded a native grass mix that was formulated by our extension range specialist because we wanted to get vegetation back on the site. This was dense forest. There wasn't a whole lot in the understory to start off with. So if you don't put in what you want, you're going to get whatever nature serves up, which is going to be cheatgrass and potential knapweed and things like that. And fireweed if you're lucky. So in this process of leaving stuff, we also wanted to monitor how much cover do we want. And it was pretty random or dispersed based on what was practical to the loggers. So here's about 10 to 20% cover, 20 to 30% cover, 30 to 50% cover, 50 to 100% cover. Okay, so what we got out of this is 10 to 50% cover is good. More than that, and you're going to inhibit plants from occupying the site. Don't want more than that. And here, you know, on the thick cover sites, they are still pretty much woody debris, which thistles seem to really love to grow in, okay? And houndsdung. So the things we don't want do best on these really thick organic layers. Okay, so we monitored this, the photo points, especially on the hardest hit areas where the equipment moved up and down over the last summer and the winter. And we're most interested again in the spring after the rainfall. So I picked out some of the most highly erodible slopes where there were gullies, steep slopes, a lot of water coming down. And ultimately I was very pleased with the results because we saw some soil movement. And so you can see this pieces of wood, anywhere from 1/2 inch to 3 inches in diameter, did a great job in stopping the soil. So there was erosion, but erosion by definition is soil off-site. Here we got the soil moved maybe 2 feet until it encountered woody debris. And so even on the slopes where there was less of a barrier, we saw that it really kept the soil on the site. Because that's what we wanted, is to keep the soil on the site to maintain the productivity of these sites and also to minimize the downstream effects. Okay, those riparian bottoms had plenty of soil. So what didn't work well? Well, big woody debris was kind of a loser. It doesn't make good contact with the soil unless you berm it in and you buck it up. So 90% of the heavy lifting was done by the fine woody debris that was left on the site. These big logs, they just provided obstructions to future work, and the landowners unfortunately were saddled with a lot of work because this is a road they wanted to use. We had a little miscommunication here. Okay, we didn't want this stuff across the road. So I spent many days helping the landowners because I kind of felt I was responsible for this. So we made a huge slash piles removing the big stuff. The little stuff was very valuable, but in any study you got to have a control. So luckily neighbors didn't want to do salvage logging. They followed the recommendation, wait a couple of years, let it recover, then we'll log. Okay, so I set up some monitoring stations where no logging was done. And at first glance, yeah, there's some soil movement, but it's really hard to measure. So I started looking at how much soil actually moved, and you can see that, call this soil creep, I don't know if there's a good term for it, but this is 3 inches of soil that had moved from the top of the ridge, and this is 20 feet below the ridge. And, you know, vegetation response, the resprouters that we found in the Sula study as well, snowberry, spirea, even 9-bark, ocean spray, those come back, but there's still a lot of space, and the soil movement on those non-stabilized slopes is pretty significant. Just to give you some ideas of how much is actually moving down slope on here. You look at it, it says, it doesn't look like much, but when you start excavating and looking, it's a lot. And it's pretty fragile soil, doesn't take a whole lot. This is a bear print, and it's enough to start destabilizing the soil. So I was out there just 3 weeks ago monitoring how things had happened. So this is spring 2 on the do nothing, let it go site. And you can see there's a lot of soil still moving down this slope on here. And so the downside is the ridgetop is becoming less productive, and you're getting a lot of soil deposit at the toe of the slope where there's already lots of soil. Okay, so as an overall landscape productivity perspective, it's not necessarily good because soil builds very slowly on those ridge tops. Now, overall, what are the comparisons? So here's the property line. A little spillover with some of the work. So to the right is salvage log right after the fire in the winter. Scatter the debris, put preferred grass seeds down. On the left side is do nothing. To give you a better perspective, pan to the left, that's the do nothing site. That's the salvage log, seed, and scatter fine debris. Okay, so get a little bit more detailed. So year 2, what about our erosion sites, our highest risk sites? Look really good. Plus the fine woody debris you get wind down there helps keep the snow on the site. We need moisture on these sites. Grass take was really good, especially where you had some obstructions that kept the grass in place, and partial shade, because these southern slopes, as Dr. Larson elaborated on, they get hotter and drier, and it's harder to get vegetation and especially trees to grow on them. So, these are just visual estimates, but you can see the grass is usually best where you had some woody debris on the site to provide it with some shade. So, things learned. Now, how about some of our other sites? So here you can see the distinct line this spring. The grasses are coming back twice as thick from the seeding. So very successful. To the left in the intact trees, it's still pretty bare, and we're getting some resprouters in there. Another thing that we were really happy to see is there were some aspen groves in there. And aspen is this extremely fire-adapted species, okay? The fire will kill the tops, but it'll cause massive resprouting. And unfortunately, there were limited places to put landings, and one of the landings ended up being right on top of where there was an aspen grove that I had ribboned off, don't touch. So Dennis DeVos and I had a few words about that and said, hey, what are we going to do? You got to get the logs off. So luckily enough, I was very pleased to see that in spite of the landing, the aspens are resprouting extremely well, even where the logging occurred on there. So aspen's pretty tough. A few other things we learned is seedlings were hard to come by, so they reseeded about 5,000 seedlings last year, and including some bigger 3-year-old ponderosa pine. And again, Dr. Larson's work is really, really important because these south slopes are going to get drier based on some of his work and the models out there. So there's no natural ponderosa pine here. But ponderosa pine should grow here really well. And so it's a big mystery why there isn't ponderosa pine around Bozeman, and I have some theories, but that's another topic. But what we found is nursery ground seedlings are really tasty to animals, and the elk came in and they peeled the bark off of every single one of these big ponderosa pines that we planted. Every single one. They didn't know what ponderosa pine was because it didn't exist there before, but nursery grown stock always seems to be sweeter, juicier, and more conducive. So that was a failure. The biggest erosion we actually saw was from the elk moving up and down. Here they're following a fence line. Now, some other things that we learned that weren't planned by us. So on the right side was the Christiansens, where we did the work and the fine fuels and all that stuff. To the left side, the landowner decided to wait a year or two. They saw what the Christiansens had done, said, hey, I'm going to log it too, and they started it this winter. So whereas logging right after the fire, the soils only have to survive that first year. And if we don't get a big thunder cloud downpouring of rain, and they didn't have that, we survived. We got the soil stabilized. Things are really looking good. Now, a year later, we're going to start some more logging. And so now we have bare soil year 2. And no vegetation on this site. This was grass seeded as well, hand seeded, but the logging has pretty much nuked a lot of the grass that did come up there, and it's not done. So we're going to go in 3 years now where these soils are exposed to massive erosion potential. So based on that, I'm a real proponent for get in there immediately after the fire. The soil is already at high erosion risk. The logging equipment can help break up those ash layers that are extremely erosive. And you can actually slow water down. Rather than hiring someone to contour fell, you're leaving all that fine woody debris on the soil surface that is actually doing all the work holding the water in place. So very pleased with the outcomes on this. Now a few other little caveats I want to throw in here. Aspen I mentioned earlier. I've looked at a lot of aspen groves over the years that have burned over. Aspen's very sensitive to fire. but it sprouts back very readily after fire. It stimulates the increased soil surface temperature, stimulates root suckering, and most of the aspen groves I have seen expand in 20% in area after fire. So the rule, or what I learned on there, is stay out of the aspen groves. Leave them alone. Don't plant conifers near the aspen groves, because now you're going to start into shading them out again. Okay, and aspen is one of those keystone species that all wildlife loves. So if that's an objective. Lodgepole pine, that's another fire-adapted species. So Fridley Fire 2001, sorry. A landowner called me. Fridley Fire burned 25,000 acres in one big black patch. And on the north end, the Kinky Ranch, I got a note on my door. Richard Kinky called me. I thought, what is it, a prank or what? Oh, very fine people. And we got up there and we did an assessment, and he cornered the market. He put I said, put this up for sale right now. It's lodgepole pine. It's going to degrade very quickly. He got a good price on it, made an awful lot of money, had 3,000 acres burn up. Okay, so this is salvage logged areas. The lodgepole pine end came in really thick, almost too thick after salvage logging. But we compared it to non-salvage log sites. Regeneration, if anything, was spottier on the non-salvage log sites, because there was a lot more soil surface movement. Seeds washed down slope. So where they collected, you got a lot of seedlings. Where they didn't collect, you didn't get any seedlings on there. And I'll elaborate on this a little bit more this afternoon on what those sites look like. Another case, Roaring Lion Fire. That was kind of a fire cyclone. If you've ever seen the video, just Google it. It's absolutely amazing how that fire progressed. Just blew over the landscape. And it hit thinned areas. And it scorched a lot of the trees, and the question is, are they going to survive or die? And so we came up with a matrix, and some of Bob Harrington's work, that if the trees are abscising needles, they're alive. If they're not abscising needles, they're dead. So we convinced a lot of landowners to leave the trees that had needle abscission near the top in the scorched area, and 90% of them came back really well. But here's an unintended consequence. Fire is a site preparation tool as well. So as we get into this bandwagon of let's burn all these landscapes, reintroduce fire to these sites, remember that if you're doing an understory burn, especially in the fall, you are creating the perfect seedbed for tree regeneration. And you might be taking a situation where we have too dense a forest, and with prescribed fire, you might create the very problem that you're trying to solve with fire. So this is that very site now. Just a couple of weeks ago, I went down, took a look. That's what it looks like now. And this isn't just an isolated area. You get 1,000 acres where you have 10,000 seedlings per acre. And I've told them all, get out there with Roundup right now before anything else has come up, and round up all these things except for mark the ones at the spacing you want. Because if you wait 5 years, now you're looking at a $2,000 per acre cost of having someone out there and thin it. So prescribed fire, we need to be careful of that, because it might create the very problem we're trying to solve with it. So again, the devil's in the details. But real quickly, back to the Valley Complex and Sula State Forest. Okay, so I've shown you this before. And so I had students go out there and do 1-year measurements, 3-year measurements. And this last year, we did 20-year measurements on these sites. So here's 3 years after the fire. The Sula State salvage logged it, made $7 million for the state coffers by doing that. But we saw precious little regeneration. These trees were so stressed they didn't have the energy to produce seeds. In the distance where we had islands of trees, natural regeneration was phenomenal. Again, I'll show more of that this afternoon. So year 3 was decided to replant this. Plus, the leasee of that land ran his cows on there, so he got permission from DNRC to seed preferred grasses on the site and spray weeds. Okay, so we had the Sula State Forest that did salvage logging, did replanting, did weed control, and did reseeding with preferred grasses. Next to it, boundary was on Forest Service, and they had this thing called cumulative impacts. So if one landowner is doing all this stuff, we're not going to do anything because salvage logging potentially is bad. And, so you know the storyline there. So Bev is disagreeing with me. Okay, I'll defer to her expertise. But in this case, the Forest Service next to it didn't want to do anything. So in comparison, that's right next door. Again, study plots and knapweed certainly went to town in there. It did on the Sula too, but there were control measures put in place on there. So it was sprayed, and we got competing vegetation down. So here we are. I took this last summer. 21 years later, this is the do nothing. Okay, we look across the landscape here. So we're on the do nothing. There's the Sula State Forest. So, you know, there are things that we can do. Fire is a natural phenomenon. I'll disagree with some of my colleagues. It is an historical phenomenon that our forests have evolved with to some level. To say it's a necessary phenomenon, well, it's going to occur, whether you like it or not, okay? Is our ecosystem going to collapse without it? No, there are consequences if you don't burn an area. So if you're managing an area, there are alternatives to keep it productive and functional in an ecological way without fire. It requires management actions. There are vast areas that we can't do this on. And so getting a fire cycle back on those sites is probably the most reasonable thing to do. And we have a lot of species that are adapted to fire. But fire has good things, beneficial qualities. It also has some very strong detrimental qualities to it. So one of my mantras is that forestry land management is site-specific. And, I'll support what Dr. Larson said, that we got to use all this information to figure out what we're going to do and where we're going to do. And, for a landowner with a south slope that used to be Doug fir, other literature has shown that conifer regeneration occurs in pulses. It's when you're in a cool wet phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, where we're getting more rain, cooler temperatures, and you have a seed crop. And so Black Hills is really pronounced. Every single age class of ponderosa pine in the Black Hills coincides with about a 3 to 5 year wet period cycle in our climate that hit them. And Northern Rockies is the same. So if you have a fire and you're trying to regenerate during a hot dry cycle, you're going to have trouble. Unfortunately, models have gotten much better. I refer to the NASA Web Predictor, long-term predictor a lot, because I've found them to be about 80% accurate in their long-range forecasts. So we have to work with the tools we have, make the best decisions, and that's why in some areas, like Doug fir burns out, we might consider converting that to ponderosa pine. So, but, nature has a lot of resilience built into it. These forests have seen this before. The climatic optimum, medieval optimum, from 800 AD till about 1300 AD was a lot warmer and drier than it is now. And our forests probably shrank quite a bit. Another side of the work I do is I work with windbreaks and shelter belts. People are growing ponderosa pines for windbreaks and shelter belts in 11-inch annual precipitation zones. Okay? So the problem with conifers is the establishment phase. You won't get natural establishment under those dry phases. But once they're established, they can survive for a long time under extremely dry conditions. So we have to consider those types of phenomenon as what do we want out of the landscape, and what do we expect out of these landscapes. So with that, I tried to go pretty fast so there'd be time for questions, discussions. I'll conclude with that and ask if there's any questions. Pat?
Peter, did you find a variation in your recovery process, I'm talking about, of the tons per acre that was put back on the site?
We didn't. Tons per acre is kind of a hard thing to measure. So I looked at cover type. How much cover? An ocular, how much cover? Because I work with 1 foot in the academic world and 1 foot in the applied world. Okay? No logger is going to be out there measuring tons per acre. What you need to do is have a visual guide. This is what we want it to look like. And so that's why I say anywhere from 10 to 50% cover of fines, not more than that. Because I've looked at a lot of old landing piles where the organic woody debris is 6 inches to 2 feet deep. And 30 years later, the only thing growing on those is snowberry, thistle, and houndstone. So, it's so low in nitrogen that the carbon to nitrogen ratio is way out of whack. And really for microorganisms to work, you need a nitrogen to carbon ratio of about 1 to 20. And those sites, you're looking at 1 to 1,000. And so nothing can eat that stuff. It's all cellulose and lignin. So, we want to slow down water and hold it on the site, but we don't want to block our native vegetation from being able to gain a foothold on it. So, and the trick is, rather than focusing on the downstream spout, we need to focus on the uphill portion where the water is coming down and collecting. We want to keep it on that site rather than having it flush down. We want it to trickle down to keep those streams going. I mean, one of the other anecdotal things I've seen and heard from a lot of ranchers is this stream used to trickle just a little bit all summer long. Now in the spring, after this watershed burn, I get a flood coming down in May and June, and then it's dry July, August, September, October. So these are changes that historically have occurred, but for that landowner, it's not beneficial. So, there's what historically occurred, and I'm not a big fan of the equilibrium theory that if you do it right, fire and vegetation will be in this equilibrium. Vegetation is always responding to changes in climate, and climate has never been a stable factor. It bounces around quite a bit. And there's a lot of credibility to the global change models, and we can expect it not only to get warmer and drier, but more variable, which means those thunderstorms that drop an inch of water in half an hour might be a more common phenomenon, and those are devastating on burned areas. So, other questions? Andrew?
Do you think aspen is going to be a long-term winner in the Northern Rockies? Do you think it's just going to kind of keep perking along? That's a great question. Aspen's been around for a long time. Because it's clonal, you look at some of these clones on a mountainside where they're growing in sagebrush, bunchgrass sites where conifers have difficulty establishing. And you can't help but think that one corner of that clone root system has a root in water and it's feeding the whole thing. So I think aspen is very site-specific. Aspen can survive there because of that flat petiole, the leaves in the sun, in the shade. That's their cooling mechanism. I think it's going to be a player. I don't necessarily think it's going to get much larger. We know from the records that last 200 years it's shrunk because it loves fire. And with the exclusion of fire, especially the last 100 years, a lot of those, and we see that all the time, these clones are being encroached on by conifers. So I think with these fires, aspen's going to be a winner. We're going to see some recovery. I don't necessarily see it expanding other than maybe up higher elevation like we saw in Upper Laird Creek where it's seeded in. But it's one of those incidentals that's pretty site-specific in my opinion. But it's one of those species that just gains a big advantage from fire, just like lodgepole pine does. So, but yeah, great. What species are going to be the winners is still one of those questions that we're scratching our heads and a lot of research on that.
On any of these erosion control projects that you're taking pictures of, have you guys tried woody biomass, like grinding? Like let's say there's not merchantable timber, but you could actually reduce the fuel reduction for your brush pile and grind them and spread that?
Had a lot of discussion, actually some case studies where we looked at it. I don't think it works as well as the fine woody debris because one, wood chips, if you put them too thick, and I'd say anything over an inch is too thick, it inhibits plant growth. Because the fungi, to break down the wood, rob the soil of nitrogen. They need to bring that nitrogen ratio up on them. So they become really infertile sites. Wood chips, when they're dry, are hydrophobic. Water runs off of them. Okay, it takes a while for them to get wet. And if they're spread thinner, they move with water. So it takes a lot less to move a chip of wood than it does a 12-inch long, half-inch diameter branch. So I think they are applicable in certain areas as barriers, but I think that the fine woody debris is, if it's making good contact with the soil, might be more effective. Plus, chipping is expensive. So there's a cost factor too. It plays a role, but I think it's going to be really site-specific where chipping can play a role. Dennis?
Well, one thing we've found that we have to do operationally, when you're looking at some of this fine woody debris, is to limb the stuff and make sure that you have a slash source that's fine material only. Separated when you limb it if possible. That way, when you do return trips with the skidder or stuff like that, you're not grabbing some of that bulky material that really doesn't sit on the ground very well and capture soil movement. You know, you're using that fine fuel, and that's just it's a big learning process on that.
Well, it's some training we need to do with our contractors, but I'll mention that that was one of the things that the contractors did on the Bridger fire on Christensen's property, is they grabbed stuff and brought it back, and I wanted it in the skid trails. That was not super effective, because you're doubling the traffic on those sites, because now they got to go back up and drag that stuff on. Then they have to walk on it to get good soil contact, and a skidder is not designed to disperse it. So we got big blobs of material here and there. What was most effective is when the harvester was dropping the trees, to smack it and to get that fine stuff right on the site, because those fire-killed trees, the bigger limbs are still green, the fine limbs, the twigs, are brittle, and they come off real well. And that's what we want to leave on that site. And what we're seeing is those don't interfere with anything now to year 2. I mean, they're not hard to walk on, the grass is growing around them. They actually provide some nice microsites to plant tree seedlings into, because these are hot, dry sites, and that's a whole nother part of this. We had a big tree seedling planting failure last year due to the elk, but also on south slopes. The only seedlings that survived were those that were sheltered in accumulations of slash, where they got some shade. Those out in the open soil, they just cooked right off. They just dried out, got too hot.
Well, when you're fighting fires in the 1st of June last year, you were pretty moisture.
Well, right, and it was a tough year, but we did get survival on these microsites. So I left a detailed planting instructions for the crew that's coming down this week to plant another 8,000 seedlings down there, is only plant in these locations. Now, if you're on a northeast slope, okay, you don't have to worry, because it only gets indirect sunlight. But the south and west slopes, boy, to get trees established, you need microsites. There's another question, yes?
I was curious what the general takeaway on reseeding, seedling trees was.
We didn't seed trees, we planted trees. Okay. That's the question. Well, these landowners want trees back. And so there's a whole other question, because old planting guidelines are 8-foot spacing with a thought of thinning. And I said, why on earth do you want to do that? So we went to a 14 to 30-foot spacing depending on the site, so that we don't have to go back and do all the pre-commercial thinning, because it's going to be 80 to 100 years before any of these trees are merchantable again. And the landowners just want to see trees on the site, and they want it forested again. So we're trying to do something that is maintenance-free, that's fire-resilient, that is bringing this back to forest, because all the seed source on this site is gone. Okay, you're not going to get any natural regeneration. And again, I'll address that this afternoon. I've got long-term sites that I've monitored over the years, looking at tree regeneration, where, when, and how. And you saw that like in the Bull Mountains at Ponderosa Pine. And east of the Divide, any of those Ponderosa pine forests that burn as stand replacing, there's no seed source. So unless you plant, it converts to grass or brush field.
And just that direct seeding, there's a lot of research that's been done of trying to direct seed, and the failure is much higher.
Well, part of
germination, there's just too many factors that we got away from direct seeding a long time.
Well, I had a study out in north of Helena on the Hilger Hereford Ranch where we looked at direct seeding. And so, the rodents all go underground. They survive the fire. And they come out and they are starving. So any seeds you put down, they are going to eat. And we put cages over seeds. And the small mice that had been weaned squeezed through these little, and they still ate the dang seeds. So direct seeding is a high-risk endeavor.
Peter, was that done with the grass seeding, though?
Grass seed's pretty small, so there's going to be some depredation on there, and that's been noted in other studies as well, but mainly by birds will hit that. So we opted for fall seeding. So this was seeded before the logging took place, because we wanted the seeds under the snow cover. So, there's stratification periods that seeds need to germinate well. And to hit the timing, just when the snow comes up, the moisture's there, that seed has to germinate, has to get roots into the soil before that top inch dries out. So spring seeding is a lot iffier. So we went with, and we actually seeded on a couple inches of snow.
because it just couldn't get a contractor there in time. But it turned out extremely well. And it's sparse enough that, you worry about competition of the grass with the tree seedlings because grass will kill tree seedlings. But really, you got a 3-year window. In 3 years, the grass is going to be so thick that it'll start killing seedlings. But if you get your seedlings in year 1 or even year 2, they're going to develop a root system that can get underneath that grass root system, hopefully at least. So in Asula, they planted in year 3, and with great success. I mean, the Sula is now a forest again. The surrounding area is not a forest. So, and Ponderosa pine, heavy seeds, natural seeds, maybe, if you're lucky, 50 yards from the tree. Doug fir, on average, 200 yards. Larch, miles and miles. So it depends what you're working with. So
I am going to comment on that. Just for anyone who was in Montana in 2000, the Bitterroot had, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of acres burned.
365.
As did the Lolo. And so a whole prioritization within the northern region, which is northern Idaho, Montana, and the Dakotas, happened, where actually teams for the National Environmental Policy Analysis, NEPA analysis, they brought in teams to help because you have to go through this analysis process. I don't know specifically on the Sula why that dropped out of the priority, but I do want to say that I know the Bitterroot harvested 50 to 90 million board feet of salvage.
Well, the initial plan was to...
And the Lolo did also. So I just wanted to clarify that we couldn't even begin to address every single acre that burned. And so the whole prioritization happened. And the funding, it takes money. So I'm just going to add that in the do nothing. I don't know the specifics of why exactly there. But I know in the reforestation, that was the other thing. The Coeur d'Alene Nursery, Wind River Nursery, we didn't even have the seeds to even start growing trees, to plant or reforest all of it.
Well, Bev, for our study, it was perfect because it gave us a control of do nothing. And, for clarification, I didn't mean it all to denigrate the Forest Service. They had planned to salvage 9,000 acres, and it got appealed, and they ended up only salvaging like 3,500 acres in all this. But the point is that we tried to figure out, is salvage logging, which is often pointed out as being detrimental to post-fire management, if done the right way, can be part of the rehabilitation. If done the wrong way, it exacerbates the problem. And so like down the Bridger, they're logging now 2-3 years after the fire. Now you're having exposed erodible soil for 3 years instead of 1 year. Andrew.
I want to go back to the discussion of direct seeding. And I would love to get your take on the push to use fleets of drones to direct seed after fire. And what your take is.
Grass seed or tree seed?
Tree seed. Like that's a thing. Like.
Well, it depends what species. So if you're going to seed larch in the fall, because it does that naturally, I would expect it would work fairly well. But you're going to need tons and tons of seed, which is a whole other thing. If you're going to direct seed ponderosa pine, good luck, because you got a million hungry rodents that are just waiting for you to give them lunch. So, it depends where, what species, but all the direct seeding trials, and I was part of a study at University of Idaho where we actually created little vermiculite pellets where we had stratified seed and charcoal and even mycorrhizae spores in there. And we tried to use those to enhance that. And we found really bad, really spotty results. And mostly we found middens, mouse and rat middens with thousands of pellets in them. So it's a lot of hurdles to make it work.
We direct seeded back in the 70s and 80s quite a little bit. And aerially and use shelter sowing methods. Do you remember those methods? Where we were walking along and putting actually a shelter sowing cup. It was almost like a mini greenhouse, over a couple of seeds dropped out of a tube, just to see what sort of effects we'd have. And none of that stuff did very well at all. Direct seeding aerially with multiple species over different landscapes and aspects and elevations, in combination with shelter sowing in the lowlands. And we didn't have the survival rate.
Well, it's all probabilities, and the more if factors you add in the probability of success, the lower your rates are. I know I'm out of time, but Sam had his hand up a long time.
Same situation you just talked about. In the 70s, we did a lot of large direct seeding, and it was either boom or bust. We either had virtually nothing or way too much.
Yeah.
And in the end, we couldn't collect enough seed to
Well, maybe final word on here. We often get hung up on if we should do something. And what we really need to look at is how do we do it? What is it that we need to do that checks off the boxes of what we want out of the system? And that's, so I really dislike when someone says, no, you can't do that because in the past we tried it and didn't work. Well, maybe we have different ways of trying it. And what is it you're trying to achieve? And for me, soil erosion is a huge, huge factor on these severely burned areas.